He walked into the gala with his mistress on his arm, ready to seal the deal that would save his company. He never imagined that the ex-fiancée he had humiliated and discarded now belonged to the one man whose approval he needed most.
Mr. Jang, this is Nia, my partner.
Seon-woo said with a smile. Before we go back to where it all began, if you've ever given everything to someone who gave you nothing back, subscribe right now and turn on the notification bell. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this one is going to stay with you. Our story begins with a 7-year-old girl standing in a half-packed apartment in Washington, D.C., watching her father wrap his books in newspaper one by one. Her name was Nia Sar. While he worked, she organized her dolls by size on the windowsill, then packed them herself, smallest to largest, no tape wasted. When her mother asked if she wanted to say goodbye to her room, Nia shook her head. "We're going somewhere new. I'll make friends there first." Her father, Dr. Amadou Sarr, was Senegalese. A quiet, exacting man who had studied economics in Dakar and linguistics in Paris before a postdoctoral fellowship brought him to Washington with 2 suitcases and a conviction, inherited from his own father. That the distance between where you start and where you can go is mostly a matter of patience. He met Diane at a faculty dinner. She was from Mississippi, a preacher's daughter who had fought her way into every room she'd ever entered, and she recognized something in the careful Senegalese economist across the table. A man who understood her particular kind of fight. They married within the year. Nia arrived 3 years later, into a house where French and English sat comfortably at the same table, where Saturday mornings smelled like her mother's biscuits and her father's café tuba, where she was raised on a single foundational belief. She came from people who had survived extraordinary things, and that was not a weight she carried, but a material she was built from. When her father was offered a post at the Institute's satellite office in Seoul, he told Diane they'd be back in 3 years. They never went back. Not because the posting outlasted its term, though it did, but because Seoul did something to the 3 of them that Washington never had. It made them a unit. And us against the confusion of a place where nobody quite knew what to do with them, where every school meeting and grocery run demanded a kind of navigation that bound the 3 of them tighter than ease ever could. Nia started school that fall, silent in a language she didn't have yet. By 9, she spoke it without an accent, the way children do when they have no choice but to find the shape of whatever container they're placed in. She learned the unspoken rules just as fast, when to bow lower, which questions were really commands, dressed up as curiosity. She was the only black girl in her class. She would be the only black girl in nearly every room she entered from that moment on. Every summer they flew back to Mississippi. At her uncle's cookout, Nia sat on the porch steps with a paper plate of ribs while her cousins played spades at the folding table. "Nia, you know how to play?" her cousin Trey called out. She knew the rules. Her mother had taught her, but in this house, spades wasn't played in silence. It was a loud, fast-moving game of trash talk and inside jokes, a rhythm Nia couldn't find the beat to. They made references to songs she'd never heard and used slang that had shifted 3 times since last summer. "Nah, I'm good," she said. Trey grinned. "That's right, you're the Korean one now. Probably play hwatu with the aunties." Everybody laughed. Nia laughed too, because what else do you do? But she set the plate down and walked inside. Through the kitchen window, she could see them dealing the next hand, already moving on. Her mother helped more than anyone. Diane had been navigating rooms that weren't built for her since before Nia was born, and she passed down survival the way black mothers do. Not as a lesson, but as running commentary on ordinary days. "They are going to see your skin first," her mother said. Nia was 11, sitting at the kitchen table with her head down, still stinging from a classmate's comment that she didn't belong in the front row of the class photo. Diane tilted Nia's chin up until they were eye to eye. "That's their blindness, Nia, not yours. You aren't a puzzle for them to solve. Your job isn't to shrink so they have more room. Your job is to take up so much space being who you are that eventually they have no choice but to see the whole of you." 25 years later, Nia could walk into any boardroom in Seoul and know, before she'd even taken her seat, exactly who held the real power and who was only borrowing it. She was the only black woman in the firm. Within 2 years, she had a reputation that outran her division. The analyst you brought in when the numbers told a clean story that wasn't true, and you needed someone who could find what was hiding underneath it. Her life in Seoul was full, the way disciplined, self-sufficient lives are full. An apartment in Mapo she'd made entirely hers over 5 years, her mother's cast-iron skillet hanging by the stove, her father's books crowding the shelves, a photograph on the windowsill of the three of them at Gyeongbokgung Palace, laughing at a street cart the day they'd finally admitted out loud that they were never going home. A small circle of friends, built slowly and kept carefully, and at the center of that circle, the one who had been there longest, Yuna. They'd met in middle school, the year Nia arrived silent and watchful, and radiating the particular composure of a child who has already decided that falling apart is not an option. Yuna sat next to her on the second day, not out of pity. Nia's lunchbox smelled better than anyone else's in the class. Diane's cooking crossed cultural lines without trying, and Yuna had always been honest about her motivations. "Your mother's food," Yuna told her years later, over drinks, "is the reason we're friends. Everything else is just history." Yuna worked in marketing at a mid-tier cosmetics company, possessed zero patience for drama she hadn't personally started, and had long ago stopped seeing Nia as the foreign girl and started seeing her as the friend who won't eat the last dumpling, even though she clearly wants it. She was blunt the way a doctor is blunt. Not to hurt you, but because she decided a long time ago that the kindest thing she could do for the people she loved was refuse to waste their time. When Nia's mother died of breast cancer, Yuna didn't show up with a card or a platitude. She walked into Nia's kitchen, set a heavy bag of groceries on the counter, and started putting things in the fridge. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be okay," Yuna said without looking up from a carton of eggs. "We both know that's a lie. I'm just going to sit here. If you want me to leave, you can tell me. I'll ignore you, but you can tell me anyway." She stayed 4 hours. Nia didn't ask her to leave once. Her father stayed on at the institute after Diane's death, quieter now in the way people get quiet after losing the person they talk to most. Nia saw him most Sundays. They ate, talked about books, and left the actual shape of the absence sitting untouched at the table between them. She was fine, genuinely fine, in the way strong people are fine. She'd found a way to carry the grief and keep walking, and had stopped expecting the weight to get any lighter. She was 32, and for the first time in her life, she was tired of her own strength. She had spent years proving she didn't need anyone, only to wake up and realize that not needing anyone is a very lonely way to live. She admitted it to Yuna once, after 3 bottles of soju had finally knocked down her guard. "I'm done being a fortress, Yuna," Nia said, staring at her reflection in the green glass bottle. "I don't want to be independent Nia tonight. I just want someone to come home to. I want someone who sees me without me having to put on a show first." Yuna had looked at her for a long moment, then refilled both their glasses. "When you find him," she said, "I'm going to need at least 3 weeks' notice before I have to share you. I've had you to myself for 20 years, and I'm not adjusting without a transition period." Nia laughed. The real one. She had no idea, sitting in that bar with the one person in the world who never needed a translation, that the man who would answer that hunger was already in Seoul. That he'd walk into a networking event on a Thursday evening, black, American, and look across a room at her the way people look when they've found something they didn't know they were searching for. And that everything she'd ever learned about being realistic would go very quiet. Nia almost didn't go to that networking event. She had been to 3 that month already, rooms full of strangers swapping business cards with the desperate efficiency of people trying to manufacture a connection. She went only because her father had raised her to do the thing that was required even when it was inconvenient. She was standing at a window on the far side of the venue, watching the Han River turn dark below the city lights, when a man stopped beside her. She didn't turn immediately. 15 years in professional rooms had taught her not to reward every approach with instant attention. "You're the only person in this room," he said, "who looks like they might actually be thinking about something." She turned. He was black, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a suit that fit the way suits fit men who know exactly how a room reads them. He watched her with something between amusement and real curiosity. "Most people in rooms like this are thinking about something," Nia said. "They're just thinking about themselves." He smiled. It wasn't practiced. "Julian Mensa. Nia Sar." He shook her hand. "Sar. French, Senegalese father, American mother. So which one taught you to read a room before you'd said a word in it?" Nia looked at him a beat longer than she meant to. Nobody asked her that. People usually asked where she was from, nodded at the answer, and immediately started talking about themselves. Julian had actually listened. They talked for 40 minutes. He told her he'd grown up in Atlanta, built a logistics startup from a shared desk, and was in Seoul, exploring strategic partnerships. "How are you finding it?" she asked. He looked at her like he'd been waiting for someone to ask properly. "Lonely. In a particular way. Surrounded by people who are perfectly pleasant, but you still go home and there's nobody to debrief with. Nobody who." He paused, hunting for the words. "Nobody who." "Who feels like home?" Nia said. Julian smiled, and for the first time, it didn't look like a networking smile. "Yeah, nobody who feels like a Sunday morning back in the States." Hearing someone else name the exact loneliness she'd been living inside for 15 years cracked something open. They exchanged numbers. He texted her from his taxi. They texted for 2 hours. Before the story goes any further, it owes Julian the same honest accounting it gave Nia. Julian Mensah was 36. He had grown up watching his mother stretch one column of numbers to cover a month of bills, and somewhere in the watching, he learned the rule that would shape his life. Numbers are never the point. What people are willing to believe is the point. He had built his startup on charisma and borrowed money. By the time he reached Seoul, his company was quietly sitting on the edge of a cliff. He hadn't come to Asia to explore partnerships. He had come to win a massive government logistics contract his company could not survive losing. And he was competing against a field that included Nia's firm. What Julian told Nia at the window was true the way most things he said were true. Accurate, but incomplete. He really did feel lonely in Seoul. He really was charmed by her. But as he walked back to his hotel that night, he also understood exactly how starved she was for someone who paid attention. He filed that away. The warmth he felt for her was real, but it was never going to get in the way of what he needed. What followed, for Nia, was the kind of relationship that happens when two lonely people find each other in an unexpected place. A private bubble the rest of the city knew nothing about. Julian remembered everything: how she took her coffee, the paper she'd written in university, a frustration about a work project she'd mentioned 3 weeks earlier. Yuna, naturally, was suspicious. 1 month in, while Nia was getting ready for a date, her phone buzzed. "Did a deep dive on your man. Startup is real. Numbers are sketch. Also, he's too hot and too smooth. Nobody is that perfect. I'm investigating," Yuna said. "You're paranoid," Nia replied. "I'm Korean. We invented paranoia. It's called pattern recognition." Nia ignored it. She was too happy. Julian was the first person who didn't make her feel like an outsider. He got the jokes nobody else understood and the frustrations she usually had to keep to herself. It felt like a relief. She thought he was listening because he loved her. She didn't realize he was actually taking notes. Over dinner and late-night drinks, Nia let her guard down. She told him about her firm's secrets, the office politics, and the exact way they planned their big bids. Julian didn't push for the information. He just waited for her to offer it up, wrapping his betrayal in the curiosity of a man who seemed to care. 7 months later, on a quiet Saturday in November, he proposed in her kitchen. He didn't do the grand gesture. There was no fancy restaurant, no bent knee in a public square. He just looked at her from across the kitchen while she made tea. "I want to do this forever," he said. He was looking at her, not the drinks, this, all of this. He held out a simple gold band. "Nia, will you marry me?" She looked at him. She thought about a lifetime of being the only one in the room, always having to be the strong one. And suddenly, she felt the sheer, terrifying relief of finally putting her armor down. "Yes," she said. The betrayal happened 3 months later, on a Tuesday evening in February. Nia was deep in deadline exhaustion, eating reheated japchae at her kitchen table and venting to Julian freely, without calculation. "They want to come in low on the freight component," she said, pushing noodles around her plate. "I told them it's too aggressive. If a competitor finds our floor, they undercut us by 2% and it still looks generous on paper." "What's the floor?" Julian asked. His voice was easy, curious, just a fiancé asking about a frustrating day at work. It took her 4 seconds to hand over a number she'd spent 6 months protecting behind an NDA. It took Julian considerably less time to understand exactly what he'd been given. Not one flicker of that understanding crossed his face. He simply nodded, said something sympathetic about leadership never listening, and asked if she wanted more wine. 11 days later, Julian won the contract. He called her, sounding lighter than air, telling her it was the biggest result of his career, and he couldn't have done it without her support. That weekend, they celebrated with champagne. She had never seen him this happy, and she felt proud of him. She had no idea she was looking at her own hard work. She found out the following Tuesday. The investigation at her firm had begun methodically. Every employee with access to the bid documents was reviewed. Nia hadn't accounted for how findable Julian was. Over the last 8 months, Julian had posted 4 warm, ordinary photos of them together on his public profile. A dinner in Itaewon, an afternoon in Bukshan. The dates lined up perfectly against the bid timeline. A man with a documented personal connection to a senior analyst had won a massive contract on a proposal that showed a level of strategic insight his company's track record didn't explain. Nia was called into the second-floor conference room, the one with the frosted glass door she'd walked past 100 times. 2 senior partners and the head of HR were waiting. They weren't cruel. They simply placed the company's conflict of interest policy on the table. The clause she'd signed on her first day, requiring her to disclose any personal relationship with a competitor. Then they placed Julian's photos next to it. Finally, the winning bid. They didn't accuse her of corporate espionage. The legal bar for that was too high. What mattered was the clause she'd signed, the silence she'd kept, and the documented relationship with the man who had just stolen their biggest contract of the year. She was fired, effective immediately, for gross misconduct. Nia did not cry. She hadn't survived a lifetime of corporate rooms by crying in front of people who held power over her. She signed what needed signing, packed her desk in 20 minutes, and carried her box out to the elevator without looking at her colleagues. She walked out into the Tuesday afternoon, stood on the pavement with the box in her arms, and dialed Julian's number. He picked up on the 3rd ring, the exact ring count of a man deciding in real time how available he should sound. "Julian," her voice cracked. "They fired me. They know about us." Silence. She could hear keyboard clicks in the background. "I'm in back-to-back meetings," he said. His voice had the smooth, distracted tone he used with vendors. "Can I call you back?" "Julian, I just lost my job. I really can't right now. I promise I'll call you back." The line went dead. Nia stood on the sidewalk, the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the silence where his voice had been. A bus hissed past. Someone bumped her shoulder. The cardboard box was getting heavy. She lowered the phone. The screen showed 0:43. 43 seconds. That was how long it took for her 10-year career to become an inconvenience. She took the box of her things home to Mappo, set it on the floor of her kitchen, and waited. She called again at 2. It rang out. At 4, she sent a text. "Julian, I really need to talk to you. Please call me." She watched the ticks turn blue. Read. No reply. At 5, it went straight to voicemail. By 6 o'clock, the silence was its own answer, but Nia wasn't ready to listen to it yet. She put her coat back on and went downstairs to hail a taxi. She told herself she was going because some things had to be said face to face. But as she watched the city lights blur past the window, a cold realization was settling in her chest. She had spent her career finding the gap between what people said and what they actually meant. For 8 months, she had ignored that gap in her own living room. The taxi pulled up to Julian's building. She got out, her heart hammering against her ribs, and walked toward the entrance. She had a key. Julian had given it to her 4 months into the relationship, pressed into her palm on an ordinary Sunday morning. She had carried it on her key ring ever since. She stood outside his door, holding that key, listening to the low, acoustic thrum of music playing inside. He was home. She knocked twice and was reaching to unlock the door when it opened from the inside. A woman stood in the frame. Beautiful, in the specific way that takes expensive upkeep. Waves of honey blonde hair too deliberate to be accidental. An ivory silk robe, the kind that whispers when you move. She held a glass of red wine. Nia could smell it, something dark and expensive, and looked at Nia with the mild, polite confusion of a woman recalibrating an evening she hadn't expected to share. In the 3 seconds it took Julian to reach the door, a drawer in Nia's mind wrenched open, and an entire year's worth of ignored details spilled out into the light. The lipstick on his collar back in March. The Friday nights he'd quietly stopped inviting her to. A hotel keycard glimpsed once in his wallet, waved off in 4 seconds flat. "Julian," the woman called over her shoulder, not unkindly. "Who is this?" Julian appeared in the hallway behind her. Joggers, a towel around his neck. His face did something complicated, then settled into a practiced, smooth mask. "Nobody important," he said. 2 words. Nia stood there with her key in her hand and felt them land with absolute permanence. The woman's eyes dropped, briefly, to the engagement ring on Nia's left hand. Something flashed across her face. surprise, maybe guilt, before she turned without another word and drifted back toward the bedroom, retreating into a space that clearly already belonged to her. Julian leaned against the doorframe. He didn't look sorry. He looked inconvenienced. "What is happening right now?" Nia said. Not a question. She needed him to say it out loud so it would become real. Julian exhaled. "Look, Nia," he rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm just not. The feelings aren't there anymore. It happens." Her throat closed. "You proposed to me. People say things," he shrugged. "We got caught up. It moved too fast. I lost my job today because of you." He crossed his arms. "That's not on me. I never asked you for anything. You talked about your work because you wanted to. That was your choice." The word choice landed like a slap. Nia stared at him. At this man she'd imagined growing old with. His face wasn't cruel. It was bored. She was boring him. Julian, treating her stunned silence as permission to wrap things up, reached into his pocket. "I owe you something," he said, reaching for his wallet. "You covered dinner last week." He pulled out a wad of bills, didn't count them, didn't smooth them, just grabbed her left hand, the one still wearing his ring. He pressed the crumpled notes into her palm and folded her fingers shut, the way you'd shove money at a child to make them go away. "Get a cab," he said. "Keep the change. We'll talk. Sometime." The door clicked shut. Nia looked down at her closed fist. She could feel the edges of the bills cutting into her palm, sharp as paper cuts, her engagement ring pressed against her knuckle from the outside. She didn't open her hand. She didn't throw the money at him. She just turned and walked away, her fist clenched so tight her nails left marks. Nia walked out of the building, soul opening up around her in all its lit, indifferent enormity. The city did not pause for her. She walked because walking was the only thing her body still knew how to do. She turned into a narrow street lined with food stalls. Steam rose from grills. At the mouth of the alley, a man sat against the brick wall with a paper cup in front of him. Nia stopped. She didn't think about it. She just opened her hand and let Julian's money fall into the cup. It wasn't generosity. It was refusal. The money was an insult wearing a disguise, and she wasn't going to hold it for 1 second longer. When the notes left her hand, she felt the emptiness against her palm. She looked down. The ring was still there. She worked the gold band over her knuckle. It came off easier than she expected, which felt like its own small betrayal. She didn't throw it away. She simply pushed it deep into her coat pocket, a cold weight she would deal with later. She sat down at the nearest stall, ordered a bowl of kimchi jjigae, and stared at the steam. When she reached into her handbag to pay, her fingers found the lining, a receipt, a pack of gum. No purse. She dumped the bag onto the counter. Nothing. Somewhere between the beggar's cup and the counter, someone had reached into her open bag and lifted the purse straight out. She hadn't felt a thing. As she searched her coat in a panic, the engagement ring slipped from her pocket. It hit the floor with a bright ping and rolled under the stool of the man sitting next to her. The man bent down, picked up the ring, and held it between 2 fingers, studying it for a half second before offering it back. "Bad day?" he asked. Nia took the ring. She meant to say, "I'm fine," the reflex answer she'd given under any other circumstance. Instead, she heard herself laugh, a broken, ugly sound. "Bad week, actually." He didn't smile or offer empty sympathy. He just nodded. "Your bill's settled. Do you need a ride?" The self-sufficiency she had worn like armor since childhood kicked in. You do not get into cars with strange men on the worst night of your life. "I'm all right," she said. "Thank you for the bill." She left. He let her get half a block before. He stood up and followed her. Nia walked the last mile home on muscle memory. No purse, no cash, no cards. She stood at her apartment door and reached into the bag for her keys. Empty. The memory hit her like a physical blow, standing in Julian's hallway, holding her keys, the door opening, dropping the whole ring of keys into the main compartment of her purse in the blur of Camille's silk robe. Her keys were in the stolen purse. That was what finally broke her. Not the fiancé, not the job, the keys. Nia slid down the door until she was sitting on the hallway floor, pulled her knees to her chest, and let out a sob that was 2 decades worth of perfect composure shattering all at once. She didn't hear him approach. She only noticed a square of white cotton held out to her, offered by a hand that wasn't asking for anything back. She looked up. It was the man from the stall. He was standing a respectful distance away, leaning against the hallway wall. "I had a feeling the walk home was going to be the hardest part," he said quietly. "My keys were in the purse." she choked out, too exhausted to build a wall. "Let me put you up somewhere," he said. His voice left no room for argument. It wasn't a request, it was a solution. "There's a hotel 3 blocks away with a door that locks and a bed you haven't cried in yet. Tomorrow you can start over. Tonight you just need to be safe." She was too empty to fight him. He walked her the short distance in silence, checked her into a quiet boutique hotel without asking for her name, and handed her the keycard. "They'll find whoever took your purse," he said at her door. "People who do this around here usually aren't careful enough to get away with it twice." It was a strange thing to say, said with a quiet certainty that made the hair on her arms stand up. Before she could ask what he meant, he nodded once and walked away. Down on the street, a black luxury sedan was idling at the curb. A man in a tailored suit, Manager Quan, was waiting by the open rear door. He had worked for the Jiang family for 22 years, and his default expression was one of bone-deep, weary loyalty. Xion Wu got into the back seat. Quan looked at his employer in the rearview mirror. He knew the exact weight of a silence like this. "You followed her," Quan said. "I made sure she was safe." "Sir, I have spent 2 decades handling your family's most sensitive contracts. This is the first time I have been asked to authorize a luxury suite for a woman we found wandering the streets without a purse." Xion Wu didn't look away from the window. "Find it, Quan." "The purse, sir?" "Everything she lost tonight. Find all of it." "Of course, sir. And what should I do with the man who took it?" "Remind him who owns that street." Upstairs in the hotel room, Nia was sitting on the edge of the bed. She had just made the only phone call she had the energy for. 20 minutes later, there was a sharp knock at the door. Yuna stood in the hallway holding a plastic bag containing 2 green bottles of soju, a family-sized bag of shrimp chips, and a portable phone charger. She took one look at Nia's face and marched past her into the room. "Don't speak. Don't apologize. Don't do that thing where you try to minimize it." She dropped the plastic bag on the bed. "I brought soju and structural violence. Sit." Nia sat on the edge of the bed. Yuna cracked open the first bottle, poured 2 shots into the hotel's paper cups, and handed one over. "Talk," Yuna said. "Start from the part where you realized you needed to call me. And don't skip anything." Nia talked. For 20 minutes straight, Yuna didn't interrupt once, didn't make a joke, didn't check her phone. When Nia finished, Yuna drained her cup and looked at her with the flat, dangerous expression of someone calculating exactly how much bail money she had access to. "Give me his address," Yuna said. "I'm going to need his address and 15 minutes alone." Nia let out a wet, exhausted laugh that turned into a cough. "You can't go to jail, Yuna. I need you." "I wouldn't go to jail. I'd claim temporary insanity. It's a very valid legal defense when dealing with tech bros." Yuna handed her the shrimp chips. "What about the guy who bought this hotel room? Who is he?" "I don't know. He just paid my bill and followed me." Yuna handed Nia a cup of soju. "Wait, let me get this straight. You don't know his name, he just paid your bill and walked you to a 5-star hotel?" I was in shock, Yuna. "He just appeared." "Okay, look," Yuna said, leaning back against the headboard. "Normal guys don't just pay 5-star hotel bills for people they met over a bowl of soup. He's either a very expensive secret admirer or a billionaire with a hero complex, and honestly, given your luck today, I'm okay with either as long as he's paying for this room. These pillows are incredible. Drink your soju." Nia finally slept at 3 in the morning. She was woken at 8 a.m. by a knock. A hotel attendant was standing in the hallway holding a twisted paper shopping bag. "This came for you," the attendant said, "from a friend." Nia brought it inside and opened it. Her purse sat at the bottom. It was completely untouched. Her credit cards were in their slots. Her cash was folded in the sleeve. Her apartment keys were resting exactly where she'd left them. Nothing was missing. Underneath the bag was a note on heavy, expensive cardstock. The handwriting was impeccably neat. "Don't drown. Keep fighting." Nia stared at the purse, her hands slightly unsteady. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the bottom of the note. He answered on the second ring. "You got the bag!" "How?" Nia asked. Her voice was steady, but her heart was pounding. "The police don't find stolen purses overnight. Nobody does." There was a pause. When he spoke again, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "I know people who know people, that's all. And the man who took it?" Another pause. "Longer this time. He won't be taking anything from anyone for a while." Nia felt a chill run down her spine. "What does that mean?" "It means you don't have to worry about him," Xian Wu said quietly. and it means you should probably decide how many questions you actually want answered. The line went quiet. Nia looked at the purse in her lap, then back at those 4 words, "Don't drown. Keep fighting." She had just survived a snake. She wasn't entirely sure she hadn't just been rescued by a shark. Nia went back to her apartment in Mapo later that morning. It felt different now, larger, emptier, but it was hers. It was the one thing Julian hadn't touched. She spent the day staring at the charcoal coat she'd hung by the door and the heavy cardstock note on her kitchen counter. She had thanked him over the phone, but the debt felt heavier than a simple thank you could cover. He didn't let her worry about it for long. He showed up at her door 2 hours after sunset in a charcoal coat, carrying a plastic bag that smelled of gochugaru and slow-simmered broth, kimchi jjigae from the stall. "You didn't have to," she said, opening the door wider. "I made too much," he replied, stepping inside. He set the food on the counter with the easy, unhurried grace of a man who belonged exactly wherever he happened to be standing. That was how the routine started. He came by twice a week. He never stayed too long, never pushed for details she wasn't ready to give. By the 3rd week, Nia found herself setting out 2 teacups before he even knocked. It was the most peaceful her life had been in years, but Nia knew that peace always came with a price. Xianwu wasn't just bringing soup, he was bringing his world with him, and his world was guarded by shadows. She started noticing the black sedans idling at the end of her street. She noticed the way a man in a tailored suit would suddenly appear in the background of her morning commute, always a respectful distance away, but always there. Nia wasn't blind, and neither was Yuna. "Don't look now," Yuna said one Tuesday, tossing a box of laundry detergent into their grocery cart. "But the men in black are back." Nia glanced down the aisle. 2 men in immaculate dark suits, both built like commercial refrigerators, were pretending to be extremely interested in a display of instant ramen. "They've been following us since the subway," Yuna said, entirely unbothered. She picked up a 10-pound bag of rice, walked directly over to the taller of the 2 men, and shoved it into his chest. "Since you're going to stalk my best friend all the way to her apartment, you can carry the heavy carbs. Walk 10 paces behind us, please." The bodyguard looked utterly baffled, but he took the rice. Nia laughed, but underneath it, the cold feeling from the hotel room was returning. The protection was creeping into her life in ways that felt less like safety and more like surveillance. The breaking point arrived 2 weeks later. Nia's savings were beginning to look thin. She had applied for dozens of positions and received only polite rejections. Firms had seen the gross misconduct flag on her record and decided she was too much of a risk. Even in her own home, the pressure was mounting. The property taxes on her Mapo apartment were due, and for the first time in 5 years, she wasn't sure the math was going to work. Then, on a Thursday morning, the miracle happened. She received an official letter from the tax office. A massive overpayment from 3 years ago had been discovered, resulting in a refund that covered her entire tax bill and then some. An hour later, her phone rang. A boutique asset management firm she hadn't applied to offered her a senior analyst position. The salary was astronomical, and the recruiter told her they were unconcerned with her history at the old firm. Most people would have celebrated. Nia was an analyst. She didn't believe in sudden, frictionless miracles. She opened her laptop and did what she was trained to do. She traced the boutique firm's holding company through 3 layers of shell corporations. Then she called a contact at the tax office and asked for the filing ID on her refund. By 3 p.m., she had found the signature. The tax credit hadn't come from the government. It had been a private donation made in her name to offset her debt. It was a digital fingerprint leading straight back to one place. Jang Min-ho, Xian Wu's father. When Xian Wu knocked on her door that evening, Nia didn't have a second teacup waiting. She had the job offer and the tax documents printed out. "Did you pay my taxes?" Nia asked. Her voice was terrifyingly calm. Xian Wu didn't insult her intelligence. "The system was penalizing you for a mistake you didn't make. I simply balanced the books." "And the job?" "They need an analyst. You are the best one I know. I simply removed the noise so they could see the signal." "You removed the noise," Nia repeated. She stepped toward him, the anger finally breaking through. "Julian mapped my life to steal from me. You are mapping my life to balance the books. You both think you know what I need better than I do. You're just moving me like a piece on a board. I was making it easier for you," he said quietly. "I don't want easy, Xian Wu. I want mine, the thing I earned. I spent 5 years earning this apartment and 20 years earning my reputation. You don't get to buy them back from me like I'm a charity case." She pointed to the door. Go." He looked at her for a long moment, jaw tight, then turned and walked out. Down on the street, Manager Kwan was waiting by the car. He opened the rear door. Seon-woo got in, pulling his tie loose with a sharp, frustrated jerk. Kwan got into the driver's seat. He looked in the rearview mirror, watching Seon-woo run a hand over his face. Kwan had driven this man away from hostile boardrooms and ruined deals, but he had rarely seen him look this rattled. "She found the signature on the tax filing," Kwan stated. "She found the connection to the firm, too." Seon-woo stared out the window at the blurred city lights. "She told me she didn't want easy. She told me to stop moving her like a piece on a board." The car was quiet for a long moment. Then, Kwan put the car in drive and spoke, his voice completely level. "Your sister would have liked her." Seon-woo's head snapped toward the rearview mirror. "That was not a criticism, sir," Kwan continued smoothly. "It was an observation. Soo-jin also hated when you cleared her path. You are treating Miss Sar like a ghost you need to save, instead of a living woman who knows how to fight." Seon-woo closed his eyes, the anger drained out of him, leaving only the exhausting truth of Kwan's words. He stayed away for 3 days. On Sunday night, Nia was walking back from the convenience store when she saw him. He was standing outside the food stall where they had first met, wearing a plain gray sweater instead of a suit. He didn't approach her. He waited for her to walk over. "I turned down the job," she said. "I know," he replied. He kept his hands in his pockets. "I don't know how to not fix things, Nia. My entire life is built on anticipating disasters and buying them off before they happen. But you were right. I treated your life like a liability I needed to manage. I won't do it again." Nia looked at him. She saw the cost of that admission on his face. "Okay," she said softly. "Have you eaten?" he asked. They sat at the stall. Over the last few weeks, Nia had finally learned the story of this specific street cart. It had belonged to Seon-woo's mother. She had run it for 30 years, waking before dawn to make the broth. When she passed away, Seon-woo couldn't bear to let it close. He kept the license and handed the day-to-day operations to the current Ajuma, an old friend of his mother's who didn't give a damn about his billions, his suits, or his corporate empire. To the rest of Seoul, Seon-woo was a shark. To the Ajuma, he was just a boy who needed to eat more and still didn't know how to hold a chef's knife. It was the one place in the city where Jang Seon-woo wasn't the boss. But tonight, the stall wasn't quiet. A massive tour group had stumbled into the alley, and the 70-year-old Ajuma was drowning in orders. Nia, who had grown up watching her mother navigate crowded kitchens, didn't think twice. She tied her hair back, slipped behind the counter, and started organizing the tickets. "Seon-woo," she called out over the noise. "Grab those bowls." For the next hour, the billionaire heir to a logistics empire was reduced to a busboy. He was terrible at it. He was too tall for the small space. He spilled broth on his sleeve, and the Ajuma yelled at him ruthlessly in rapid-fire Korean for not cutting the scallions fast enough. "Faster, tall boy! My grandmother cuts onions faster, and she's been dead for 10 years, she barked. Nia stood by the boiling pots, laughing so hard her stomach hurt. Seon-woo looked over at her, flour on his cheek, a scowl on his face that completely melted when he saw her smiling. He didn't have his armor on. He wasn't the boss. He was just a man covered in scallions, and for the first time, Nia realized she wasn't just attracted to his power, she liked him. 2 weeks later, Nia called him. "I got a job," she said. Her voice was bright, lighter than it had been in months. "Mid-tier logistics firm. The pay is less than my old firm, but the division head actually read my market analysis instead of just looking at my termination record. I earned it." Seon-woo smiled, standing in his high-rise office, looking down at the city. He hadn't made a single phone call. He hadn't touched a thing. "You earned it," he agreed. "I'm proud of you." "Do you want to come over?" she asked. "I'll make tea. I'll be there in 20 minutes. When he arrived, she had 2 cups waiting. They sat at the kitchen island, and for the first time, the silence between them didn't feel like a negotiation. The protector and the liability were gone. Seon-woo looked at her, his expression shifting into the heavy, serious stillness she had seen the very first night they met. "I need to take you somewhere," he said, setting his cup down. "There are things I haven't told you, about my family, and about why I was really at that food stall the night you lost your purse." Half an hour later, Seon-woo drove her to a place he had never taken anyone outside his bloodline. It wasn't a restaurant. It was a service stairwell at the back of the first hotel he had ever bought with his own money, long before his father's shadow had reached his bank account. They climbed until they reached the roof, emerging into the cool night air. There was a single table set for two, looking out over a city doing what Seoul did every night, glittering, indifferent, and beautiful. "I brought you to the only place I own," Seon-woo said, "that I've never once used for business." Nia understood. By now, she had learned to read the spaces between his sentences. This wasn't just a date, it was an opening. They ate in a comfortable silence, the city lights flickering millions of miles below. It was only after the plates were cleared that Seon-woo set his wine glass down. His face changed. The shark mask wasn't slipping. It was being set aside entirely. His jaw worked for a moment as he reached across the table, his hand finding hers. "I told you I'd explain what I actually do," he said, his voice low against the wind. "But first, I need to tell you why I was really at that stall the night we met." Nia waited. "My family moves freight," he started. "Legitimate logistics, shipping lanes, port contracts, the kind of thing that looks clean on paper." He paused. "And then there are the other rooms, the ones my father sits in, where questions don't get asked, where zeros get added to ledgers at 2 a.m., and nobody ever writes down why." He looked at her directly. "I've sat in those rooms, Nia. I've signed things I can't unsign. I'm telling you this because if you're going to walk away, I need you to do it now. Before," he stopped, "before I can't let you go." Nia listened. She didn't flinch. She had spent a career finding the truth underneath numbers, and there was a strange, quiet relief in finally being handed the whole figure at once. "Is that all of it?" she asked. "No," he said. "The rest is about my sister Sujin." His voice changed then. It became smaller, tighter. He told her about a girl who was the only person in the family the business hadn't managed to touch. The girl who told him she'd rather be wrong about people than right about them. "She met a man in Busan," Seon-woo said. "A logistics consultant. He made her feel like the only person in the room for 5 months. He listened. He remembered her favorite tea. He asked questions about our father's shipping partners." Nia felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The call started to thin out as soon as he got the introductions he needed. Seon-woo said. He disappeared slowly, one ignored text at a time. "She told me she was fine, and I believed her. I was too busy managing a merger to actually look at my own sister." He looked out at the dark expanse of the Han River. "She was found in that water 18 months ago. The police called it an accident. I call it a man who took everything she was and left her with nothing to hold on to." He turned back to Nia, his eyes hard and cold. "His name was Julian Mensa." The name landed like a stone in deep water. Nia went perfectly still. A coldness started at her fingertips and rushed inward. She reached out and clenched the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white as she braced herself against the sudden dizzying drop in her chest. "I've been tracing him for a year and a half," Seon-woo said, "building a file, closing every door he has, waiting for him to come back to Seoul so I could destroy him. The night I saw you at the stall, I didn't know who you were. I just saw a woman who looked exactly the way my sister looked the last time I saw her alive." He squeezed her hand. "It was days later that my people connected the names. I found out you were the analyst from the bid. I found out you were his fiancé." Nia pulled her hand back, her eyes narrowing. "So I was a file to you, a weapon you could use to finally hit him back." "At first," Seon-woo admitted, "he didn't blink or look away. I sat with that file for a long time. I thought about how easy it would be to recruit you. But then I kept coming to your apartment. I kept drinking your tea, and I realized that if I used you as a weapon, I would be doing exactly what he did. I'd be mapping you for my own ends." He looked at her with a raw honesty that Julian had never possessed. "I brought you here tonight because I won't have a relationship built on a secret. You know who I am now, and you know why I hate him." Nia was quiet for a long time. She looked at the city, then back at the man across from her. "I understand why you want to destroy him," she said softly. "If someone did that to Yuna, I don't know what I'd do, but I can't be part of it, Seon-woo. I spent a year letting Julian live rent-free in my head. I'm not giving him another day." Seon-woo looked at her. "You're asking me to let him walk?" "No. I'm asking you not to let the chase turn you into something you can't come back from. Revenge poisons the person holding it. I've seen it. I've been it. I made a promise to my sister," he said quietly, "the night of her funeral. I told her I would make sure he understood what he took. And if keeping that promise costs you everything else?" He was silent. "I won't love a man who's become a mirror of the thing he's hunting," Nia said, her voice steady and clear. "And you won't love yourself either. Xian Wu looked at her for a long moment. He saw the strength it took for her to say that. Then, he reached across the table and took her hand again. "I won't lose myself," he said. "I'm not going to put him in the river, Nia. I'm just going to let him see what drowning feels like. One night. One closed door. And then I'm dropping the file. I'm done." She studied his face. She saw the grief underneath the resolve. She saw the brother who had failed to save his sister and had carried that weight for 18 months without setting it down once. "One night," she said. "And then you come back to me. I promise." He leaned forward. She met him halfway. The kiss was soft, unhurried, and tasted like the first honest thing either of them had let themselves want in a very long time. When they pulled apart, the heavy, serious air on the rooftop had finally broken. Xian Wu brushed a stray curl from her cheek, his eyes entirely focused on hers. "There's a gala in 2 weeks," he said, his voice quiet. "The anniversary of the company my father built. It's a room full of people who only care about what they can take from me. I want to walk in there with you on my arm, as my partner. Just us." Nia looked at the city spread out beneath them, then back at the man holding her hand. "I'll need a dress," she said. 2 weeks later, Nia's apartment looked like a war zone. Yuna had arrived at 4 o'clock with 3 garment bags, a tackle box of high-end cosmetics, and the manic energy of a field general preparing for an invasion. "We have exactly 3 hours, Yuna announced, setting up a ring light on the kitchen table. "That is time for hair, makeup, dress, and emotional armor. Sit." Nia sat. "You know it's just a dinner, right?" "It is not just a dinner," Yuna said, aggressively blending foundation. "You are walking into a high society gala on the arm of a man who owns half the city and actively scares people. We are going to make you look so devastatingly expensive that men will apologize just for making eye contact." For the next 2 hours, Yuna delivered a running commentary on the situation while pinning up Nia's hair. "Let me make sure I understand this evening," Yuna said around a mouthful of bobby pins. "You're going to a Mafia gala with a man who could probably have someone erased from the national census with one phone call, while I sit across the street drinking overpriced gin, just in case I need to call the police. Or an ambulance." "It's not a Mafia gala, Yuna," Nia said, though she smiled at her reflection. "Nia, his right-hand man is named Manager Quan, and he wears a 3-piece suit to buy milk. I don't care what his business card says, that's a man who knows where the bodies are buried. Now lean your head back and stop moving." At exactly 6:45, there was a firm knock at the door. "Stay," Yuna commanded. "Let me establish dominance early." Yuna marched to the door and pulled it open. Xian Wu stood in the hallway, wearing a black tuxedo cut so perfectly it looked lethal. He was holding a single, stunning black orchid. Yuna looked at him. She looked at the orchid. She crossed her arms. "If you hurt her," Yuna said, completely deadpan, "I don't have underworld connections. But I do have a marketing budget, a Twitter account, and an absolute lack of boundaries. I will make you go viral for the worst reasons imaginable. Do we understand each other?" For possibly the first time in his adult life, Jang Seon-woo was entirely speechless. He stared at the 5'4" marketing manager wielding a makeup brush like a weapon and realized she was completely serious. "Understood," Seon-woo said softly. "Good." Yuna stepped aside. "She's ready." Nia walked out of the bedroom. She was wearing midnight blue silk that draped like water and her mother's pearl earrings. After a lifetime of trying to be the right version of herself for other people, the Korean version, the American version, the professional version, she finally looked like the original. No translation required. Seon-woo's breath hitched. The imposing, untouchable executive vanished entirely, leaving only a man looking at the woman he loved. He held out the black orchid. "They don't grow in ordinary soil," he told her quietly. "They need volcanic ground, hostile to almost anything else trying to take root. Most flowers would die in it, but this one thrives. So do you." Nia took the flower, the velvet petals cool against her palm. She looked up at him, and for a second the air felt thin. It wasn't just a compliment. It was the first time in her life someone had looked at her scars and called them a masterpiece. Half an hour later, across the street from the gala venue, Yuna walked into a dimly lit cocktail bar with a direct line of sight to the ballroom entrance. She ordered a gin and tonic and took a seat by the window. A moment later, a man in an immaculate suit slid into the booth across from her. "May I ask what your interest is in the building across the street?" Manager Kwan asked, his face a mask of weary professionalism. Yuna didn't miss a beat. "May I ask who's asking?" "I'm asking, and I'm watching. Look at us, both doing things. Yuna took a sip of her gin. You're Xian Wu's right-hand man, aren't you? The one who wears a suit to buy milk. I'm here for Nia. Quan sighed, a sound that carried 22 years of dealing with difficult people. I assure you, Miss Sar is perfectly safe this evening. Great. I'll stay here and make sure. Quan looked at her. He had no framework for this interaction. He dealt with rival executives and hostile board members. He had never dealt with a Korean marketing manager with a gin glass and the protective instincts of a mother bear. Deciding it was easier than fighting, Quan signaled the bartender. Bring her something better than what she's drinking, he ordered. He looked back at Yuna. If we are going to be on a stakeout, we are going to drink properly. Yuna smirked. I think we're going to be friends, Manager Quan. Inside the ballroom, the chandeliers cast a warm, patient light over 300 of the wealthiest people in Seoul. The room noticed Nia and Seon-woo the moment the doors opened. Conversations adjusted their volume. A waiter changed course mid-stride. Two men near the bar abandoned their drinks and straightened up. Nia had spent a lifetime running the calculation of how to fit into a room. Tonight, the calculation didn't apply. The room had already decided who she was, and it was rearranging itself around her. Julian and Camille had arrived shortly before them. Julian was already sweating beneath his composure. His startup was hemorrhaging money, and he needed to close the freight deal tonight with the holding company's mysterious owner, or his business would be dead by Friday. Camille, in a red dress chosen to turn heads, had no idea how close to the edge he actually was. Julian had spent 3 months courting the public face of the company, a man named Yoon Tae-min, mistaking professional politeness for friendship. He was certain he'd identified exactly whose approval his deal required. He had no idea there was a name above Yoon's. A few minutes into the evening, one of Seon-woo's staff appeared, with the urgency of someone who'd run out of room to delay. A principal investor had arrived early and was asking questions. Seon-woo's hand found the small of Nia's back. 5 minutes. Possibly 10 if he's in one of his moods. I'll survive 5 minutes alone at a party, she said. I've had practice. He almost smiled at that and went. Nia found a table near the edge of the floor and a glass of champagne she had no real intention of drinking. It was there, alone, that Julian found her. Camille saw her half a second before he did, a flicker crossing her face of a woman placing someone she genuinely hoped never to place again. She kept quiet. Nia. Julian said it like he was confirming something to himself. I didn't expect to see you here. She looked up at him with an expression that gave him absolutely nothing. Julian. This is Camille. He gave the same careless half-introduction he'd once used in his own doorway. Camille offered a tight, polite smile. How did you get past the door? Julian asked, his gaze sweeping the room. This isn't exactly your usual scene. I was invited, Nia said. She didn't offer an explanation. She didn't need to. Of course you were. He stepped closer, dropping into the quieter voice he used to keep just for her. I'm closing something tonight that's going to put my company somewhere it's never been. 9 figures. But it's good to see you're getting out, after everything. I worried about you after the firm let you go. I'm glad you found your way too, whatever this is. You seem distracted, Julian, Nia said, her voice quiet and perfectly calm. I'm sure whatever business you're here for is very important. You shouldn't let me keep you from it. I'm not distracted, he snapped, his eyes darting toward the VIP area. No, Nia agreed, her gaze already drifting past him as if he were part of the furniture. Of course not. Good luck with your evening. It was then that Seon-woo finished with the investor and started back across the room. He didn't acknowledge Julian. He walked a straight line to Nia and held out his hand. Would you like to dance? Yes, she said, and put her hand in his like there had never been another answer. He led her onto the floor without once looking back. The band was mid-song. Unhurried, he drew her in, his hand settling at the exact center of her back. From the table, Julian watched them. He went very quiet. The particular quiet of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the answer to. Jealousy arrived first, sharp and unflattering. Disappointment came underneath that, at how unguarded she looked in someone else's arms, how her head tilted just slightly toward his shoulder, how she laughed at something he said. And beneath both of those was the specific humiliation of having just told a woman he had discarded that he was glad she had found her way to whatever this was while she danced with a man the entire room had quietly rearranged itself around. He could not sit with it. The sight made his stomach turn. The slow, sour recognition hit him. Nia was not broken. She had not spent all that time curled around the wound he had dealt her. She had not faded into someone smaller. She was luminous. And she was luminous in the arms of someone else. Julian stood up. Camille was saying something, asking where he was going. He didn't hear it. He excused himself mid-sentence, a reflex to stop her from talking, and started walking. He walked out of the ballroom. He did not look back at the dance floor. He walked through the double doors, down the corridor, away from the image of his ex-fiancée in another man's arms. He found himself in the conservatory, a smaller room adjacent to the main hall, set up with a bar. It was quieter here. He stood by the window, looking at his reflection. He needed the one thing in this building he could still control: the deal. He found Yoon Tae-min at the conservatory bar, holding a whiskey. "I want to close the freight terms tonight," Julian said abruptly. "Get it signed before the room thins out." Yoon's smile stayed pleasant, entirely unmoved. "I can walk you through the terms again, but final sign-off isn't mine to give. That goes through someone above me." "Then let's find them," Julian said, recalculating instantly. A bigger signature was worth more anyway. "That's not usually a problem," Yoon said, glancing toward the ballroom doors. "He's actually here tonight." Julian felt a surge of anticipation. "Then let's not keep him waiting." They walked back toward the ballroom together. As they crossed the threshold, Yoon's eyes drifted to the edge of the dance floor. "That's him, actually. Right there." Julian followed the gesture. It took him a full second to place the face, the quiet, imposing man who had just finished dancing. It took him another half-second, considerably worse than the first, to place the woman standing beside him in the midnight blue dress. The two facts arrived together and refused to separate. The man holding his deal's entire future in one signature was the same man holding Nia. "Julian?" Yoon asked, noticing the sudden drained look on his face. "Is everything all right?" Julian didn't hear him. He was calculating the distance between his failing company and the man across the room. He needed that signature, even if it meant walking into a fire he'd started himself. "I need to meet him," Julian said, his voice tight. "Yoon, please, can you introduce us? Right now." They crossed the ballroom, just as Seon-woo and Nia stepped off the floor. Nia looked up, saw Julian approaching, and her face closed like a door. "Mr. Jang." Yoon's voice carried the easy deference of a man introducing his employer. "This is Julian Mensah. He's the one I mentioned for the freight contract. He was hoping to close with you tonight." Whatever Julian had built in his head, whatever smooth pitch or confident handshake he'd prepared, it all disintegrated. He had spent months trying to reach the man at the top, never imagining that the man at the top had been watching him break Nia's heart from the shadows. His mouth opened a half-second before anything useful arrived to fill it. "Mr. Jang," he managed to say. He extended a hand that wasn't quite steady. Seon-woo looked at Julian's outstretched hand. He looked at it as if it were a strange, uninteresting object. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the string quartet felt 1,000 miles away. Seon-woo's own hand stayed exactly where it was, pressed firmly against the small of Nia's back, steady, unmoved. He didn't take it. "This is Nia," Seon-woo said, his voice carrying just far enough for the people at the nearest tables to hear. "My partner." Julian's hand hung in the air for 3 long seconds before he dropped it. His collar looked suddenly tight. Nia watched his Adam's apple bob as he swallowed. He turned to Nia, forcing a brittle smile. "Nia, good to see you again." "Have you two met?" Seon-woo asked, the idle question of a man who already knew the answer and wanted to hear how she'd give it. "Someone I used to know," Nia said. Julian's jaw tightened. He recognized the tone. It was the same one he'd used to dismiss her in his hallway. Desperate, he started to pitch. He spoke too fast, throwing out profit margins and delivery timelines, his voice straining for its usual confidence, even as a bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Seon-woo let him finish. He waited for the silence to become absolute before he spoke. "The partnership will not be moving forward," Seon-woo said quietly. "I'd make other arrangements before the quarter closes." Julian's face collapsed. First came confusion, then recognition, and finally a flash of raw panic. "Wait, we can. There's room to negotiate," Julian stammered. "We can lower our bid. We can find a new floor." Seon-woo was already turning, his hand guiding Nia away. "There is no floor for you, Julian. There is only the exit." They walked away. Behind them, Nia heard Julian say her name once, sharp and desperate. She didn't look back. Only when they reached the cool air of the foyer did Nia feel the tension in Seon-woo's touch. His hand wasn't trembling. It was rigid, his knuckles locked with the sheer force of the self-control it had taken not to do something much worse to the man behind them. It was the only sign that the evening had cost him anything at all. Julian stood there a moment longer than the room was kind enough to let pass unnoticed. When he turned back to his table, Camille was looking at him. Her expression was no longer just sour. She had watched enough of it to understand the shape of what had happened. "What was that?" she said. "Julian, what just happened?" He didn't answer her. The unhurried pace he prided himself on was gone, replaced by something closer to a panicked retreat. Camille sat where he left her. She thought about the way Julian's voice had changed earlier, pretending he hadn't noticed Nia. She thought about the word partner, and the way Julian had physically collapsed when the other man used it. She finally understood exactly what kind of man she was with, and exactly what came after her usefulness ran out. She didn't cry. She picked up her clutch, walked the length of the ballroom alone, and called her own car. Across the street, framed by the window of the cocktail bar, Yuna saw Julian stumble out of the venue alone. He looked like a man who had just watched his house burn down. Yuna raised her gin glass. Manager Kwan raised his scotch. They clinked glasses in a silent, deeply satisfied agreement. 20 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the ballroom opened again. Nia and Seon-woo stepped out into the crisp Seoul night. They didn't look like people who had just dismantled a man's life. They looked like two people ready to go home. They crossed the street to where the black sedan was idling. Waiting by the rear door was Manager Kwan, looking as impeccably composed as ever. Leaning against the bumper next to him, finishing a skewer of street food, was Yuna. Nia stopped, her eyes moving from Yuna's skewer to Kwan's stoic face. "I see you two have been getting along." "Kwan is a delight," Yuna said, wiping her hands. She looked Nia up and down, then looked at Seon-woo. "I saw Tech Bro stumble out of here looking like he just got audited by God." "I take it the evening was a success?" "It was a success," Seon-woo said mildly. Yuna nodded, then pointed a finger at Seon-woo's chest. "You passed. I'm keeping my eye on you, but for tonight, you passed." Seon-woo actually smiled, a real, quiet smile. "Thank you for your blessing, Yuna." Yuna hugged Nia, tight and fierce. "Call me tomorrow! I want every single detail, including what his face looked like when he realized he was broke." She pulled back, gave Kwan a two-finger salute, which Kwan returned with a single, perfectly dignified bow of the head, and hailed her own taxi. Kwan opened the rear door. "To Mappo, sir?" "To Mappo, Kwan," Seon-woo said. The car ride back was quiet, but it was the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Nia sat with her shoes off, watching the neon lights of Seoul smear across the window. She thought about the woman who had walked out of a boardroom with a box of her life months ago. That woman had spent years being a bridge, always the one standing in the middle, translating herself for everyone else. Tonight, she didn't feel like a bridge. She felt like the destination. Beside her, Seon-woo looked up from his phone and took her hand. "I got a message from the office," he said. "Julian tried to call 3 of our subsidiaries from the back of his taxi. He's looking for a back door into the deal." "Will he find one?" "No. Every door is locked. He'll find out by Monday that his creditors are moving in." Seon-woo put his phone away. "It's over, Nia." Nia looked out at the Han River. She thought about the one night Seon-woo had asked for. He had kept his promise. He hadn't been brutal. He had simply been a wall. "And you?" she asked softly. "Are you done?" Seon-woo looked at her, and for the first time, the ghost of his sister didn't seem to be sitting between them. "I'm done," he said. "I dropped the file at the office before we left. Kwan is having it shredded tomorrow." He pulled her hand up and kissed her knuckles. The car pulled up to her building in Mappo, but they didn't go upstairs. They walked to the food stall at the end of the alley. The Ajuma saw them coming and didn't even wait for them to order. She just set down 2 steaming bowls of kimchi jjigae. "You're late, tall boy," she barked at Seon-woo, though she tucked an extra serving of pork into his bowl. "The scallions are already getting cold." They sat on the plastic stools, the steam rising between them. Nia looked at Seon-woo, the man who owned hotels and shipping lanes, currently being bossed around by a woman who sold soup for $5 a bowl. Nia took a sip of the broth. It was spicy, hot, and exactly what she needed. "You know," she said, "when I moved here as a kid, I was so afraid of being an outsider. I spent my whole life trying to be so perfect that nobody would notice I didn't belong." Seon-woo looked at her over the rim of his teacup. The steam was fogging her vision slightly. "And now?" "Now I think belonging is overrated." Nia said. She reached across the plastic table and took his hand, the left one, where Julian's ring used to sit. Her thumb brushed across her bare fourth finger. I'd rather be exactly where I am. Sion-woo didn't say anything. He just lifted his cup and clinked it against hers. The sound was small and bright in the narrow alley. They sat like that for a long time, steam rising between them. A taxi honked down the block, and the smell of exhaust mixed with the garlic from the stew. The rest of Seoul was still rushing, but for the first time in her life, Nia didn't feel like she had to keep up. If this story moved you, smash that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter. Tell us in the comments, have you ever had to walk away from everything to find out who you really were? We read every single story you share. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.